So as I think you all know, because you signed up for this, we're going to be speaking about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. What do these things mean? How do we recognize them? What do we do about them? I think is the key. And so, hopefully by the end, everyone will feel kind of confident answering those questions. But first, just generally speaking, does anyone have any idea how we could define the term anti-Semitism? And it doesn't have to be a perfect kind of dictionary definition, but could be examples or just things that you think are would fall under this term anti-Semitism. Any ideas? You can unmute or put in the chat, whatever you would like. If you're not sure, that's also okay, because that's what I'm here for. So just give it a minute in case anyone's typing, and then all right. So according to the dictionary, we have 3 different examples of definitions up on the screen. They're very similar. Basically, hostility towards, discrimination against Jewish people, hatred of Jewish people. That's kind of the classic dictionary definition of anti-Semitism. And the problem with that is they're quite vague, they're quite broad, these definitions. They don't really tell us so much in terms of if something happens, if we hear about something, if someone says something to us, what do we do? How do we know if it's actually, hostility or discrimination? How do we define that? And so these are kind of a good starting point, but by the kind of towards the middle of this session, I'm going to introduce some more specific ways that we can identify anti-Semitism and kind of be able to define it a little bit more clearly. But before we do that, it's important to understand that anti-Semitism is not something new, and it's also not something that always looks the same. So we can see here kind of different phases of anti-Semitism. It's often referred to as a mutating virus, as something that's sort of kind of like coronavirus. It started as one thing, and then there's a mutation, and then it looks a little bit different, and then we have to figure out how to deal with this new form, and then it changes again as we get kind of a handle on it. And so in a similar way, anti-Semitism basically has existed as long as the Jewish people have existed, going all the way back to biblical times. There were nations that were basically enemies of the Jewish people, purely because of anti-Semitism, not for any kind of practical reason. And the root of that kind of ancient biblical anti-Semitism was that the Jewish people were the first people to introduce the concept of monotheism to the world, meaning that there's basically the idea that we believe in one God. Until this time, all of the nations in the world were polytheists. So they believed in lots of different gods, the god of the sun, the moon, the grass, all different gods. And the reason that monotheism kind of led to anti-Semitism is because with the idea of monotheism, all of a sudden, we can have this idea of absolute right and wrong, of there being one set of morals of right and wrong that applies to everyone. And that was a major threat to the way of life of a lot of people at the time. And so they hated the Jews because we posed that threat to kind of their societal norms. And then as things changed and developed, Christianity comes on the scene, and there is this false idea that the Jewish people are responsible for the death of Jesus, who Christians viewed as their Messiah, their Mashiach. And so obviously, if someone is responsible for the death of your Messiah, you're going to hate them. And so in the early Christian period, a lot of anti-Semitism was directed towards Jews for this reason. Then moving into the Enlightenment period, which was a period where society in general was sort of moving away from religion and more towards logic and science and rationality and reason, So it didn't make sense to hate Jewish people for religious reasons anymore. And so the reason sort of changed and became about our race, our genes, saying that we are inferior racially, genetically. This is the kind of phase of anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust. And then today we have this kind of, again, anti-Semitism has morphed. And one of the most prevalent forms of anti-Semitism that we see today is what we call anti-Zionism. And Zionism is the belief in the Jewish, or support for the Jewish people's right to live independently in our ancient homeland, which is Israel. And so anti-Zionism is basically being opposed to that, saying the Jewish people don't have the right to live independently in their homeland. And we're going to discuss this kind of anti-Zionism aspect of anti-Semitism quite a bit tonight. But something that's just kind of important to realize is that a trend, even though anti-Semitism morphs and changes and looks different with each kind of generation, something that's common is that basically anti-Semitism takes the form of whatever is considered to be the most kind of despicable, undesirable thing in a given society. So whatever that horrible thing is put onto the Jewish people. So, for example, with Enlightenment anti-Semitism, the worst thing to be was racially inferior. It was all about being, you know, in Nazi Germany, it was about being the Aryan race, were the best race to be, and anything else was inferior. And then that's put onto the Jewish people as being this, this inferior race. Today, one of the things that our society considers to be, you know, the most despicable, the most kind of bad thing you can be, is discriminatory or racist. And that's a good thing. We should find that to be unacceptable, to be racist or discriminatory. The problem is that when that's unfairly placed onto the Jewish people. And so often a reason that is given for being anti-Zionist is saying that Zionism is racist or is discriminatory because it's only about the Jewish people. When really Zionism doesn't say anything about anyone else. It doesn't say that Israel is only for the Jewish people or that the Jewish people should have more rights in Israel than anyone else. That's simply something, this false idea that's again placed onto the Jewish people. So before we get into anti-Zionism and how we recognize it, it is important to look over and be familiar with some common themes and imagery from more classical anti-Semitism, because even though anti-Semitism does morph and change over time, the older forms still are still around. They don't just disappear when a new form of anti-Semitism pops up. It just kind of adds to the list. So it's important to be able to recognize some of the more classic anti-Semitic tropes and images so that, again, we can sort of respond appropriately when we see them. And one of them is this association, many of you might have heard this before, that Jews are obsessed with money, are obsessed with wealth, are money hungry, are greedy, anything kind of like that, associating Jews with money and wealth is a classic anti-Semitic kind of trope. And it almost sometimes seems like a compliment. Like sometimes people use it and they don't see anything wrong with what they're saying because they're like, oh, you're good with money. Like, what's the problem with that? But this can actually be very dangerous because there have been instances where, for example, in France, there was an instance where a Jewish man was basically kidnapped and held for ransom by a group of terrorists because they thought that the Jewish community was so wealthy that they would be able to pay this ridiculously high ransom that they couldn't pay. And they thought that because they were under the impression that all Jews are ridiculously wealthy. So something that seems kind of not so problematic, not so dangerous, can actually be really problematic. And that's why if someone kind of tries to make this claim or make this association, it's important to point out to them that this is anti-Semitic and not true. Another classic idea is that Jews are control the media, control politics, control the economy, basically that Jews sort of are running the world and have way too much control in a given area of society. And again, this is one that people might almost be saying in like a complimentary way, except that it can also have very dangerous ramifications as well. Another one is that Jews are plotting world domination, this idea that we're trying to take over the world. This comes from a document that was produced, basically an anti-Semitic propaganda document from the former Soviet Union called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And it kind of spread this idea that Jews are plotting to take over the world. Another one is that Jews are poisoning the drinking water of non-Jewish people. This, I believe, originated in medieval times when there were wells. Most people got their water from wells. And there were also lots of diseases that would spread because of how people were living, and hygiene standards were very different. And Jewish people would often not be as affected by the different kind of plagues and diseases that were going around, probably maybe in part because of our practices around hand washing before eating. But because of that, people said, oh, the Jewish people aren't getting sick. It must be that they're causing all of us to be sick. And that's something that, even though today we don't really have wells or in the same way, we still see this idea popping up in kind of new forms. For example, again, with COVID, especially towards the beginning, there were lots of conspiracies about the Jewish people spreading COVID and creating COVID. So definitely still something to be aware of and kind of point out when you, or call out when you see it. Blood libels, again, going back to medieval times, this was basically a concept where whenever there was usually a Christian child who was found to have died for whatever reason, the local Jewish community was often blamed for this child's death. And this led to a lot of pogroms and attacks on local Jewish communities in retaliation. And again, this is something that we see today, not in exactly the same way, but this kind of willingness to place the blame on the Jewish people for death, for tragedies that occur. And finally, depicting Jewish people with kind of subhuman imagery. So you can see a lot of examples of that over here with like overly large features, or depicting us not even as humans, but as like monsters or rats or different animals. These are all kind of classic anti-Semitic images. So that's classical anti-Semitism. And now we're going to focus pretty much for the rest of the time more on anti-Zionism, which again is probably the most prevalent form of anti-Semitism that we see today. And so the question is, how do we recognize when a statement that's made about Israel, something critical of Israel, is anti-Semitic? How do I know? How do I know when it's not just someone having an opinion and being critical versus when it's actually crossing the line and it's anti-Semitic? So there are a couple tools that we have to be able to identify this. The first is what we call Natan Sharansky's 3D test. Natan Sharansky is from the former Soviet Union. He was actually imprisoned there for many decades because he wanted to make Aliyah and move to Israel. And eventually he was released and allowed to move to Israel, and he became a really big leader in the Jewish community. He still is in Israel and around the world. And he got involved in Israeli politics and kind of communal life in lots of different ways. And he created this test. It's basically a list of 3 different things that all start with D. And if a statement about Israel crosses one of these 3 lines, then according to this test, we know that it is anti-Semitic. So the first one is demonization. So basically, if Israel is being demonized, if its actions are being blown way out of proportion and it's kind of just being represented as this like monster of a country, then that would be considered anti-Semitic. The second D is double standard. So if Israel is being held to a standard that is higher than other countries in similar situations would be held, that's anti-Semitic as well. So for example, you can see in this cartoon here, often Israel will be faced with rocket attacks from its neighbors, sometimes from Syria, sometimes from Hamas in Gaza. And when this happens, these rockets are aimed at Israeli civilians. They're trying to cause a lot of damage and harm. And so when Israel will respond in order to prevent these further attacks, Israel will often be told by the international community, by the media, to use restraint in their response and not to respond all the time. And this is, we call a double standard, because I think we could all kind of guess what would happen if, for example, Canada were to start sending rockets into America. America would probably respond more harshly than Israel does. And no one would expect America to use restraint because they're under attack. Their civilians are under attack and they need to protect them. So anytime Israel is expected to act in a way that no other country could reasonably be expected to act, that's called a double standard. And finally, delegitimization. And delegitimization is basically saying, this is sort of anti-Zionism. It's saying Israel does not have the right to exist. So if a statement crosses one of these three lines, according to Natan Sharansky's 3D test, it would be considered anti-Semitic. And this test is really helpful because it's easy to remember, right? It's just 3Ds. You can remember them, you can write them down, you can Google it easily, but it's quite easy to remember. And so we're able to use it in order to sort of identify for ourselves, is something anti-Semitic or not? However, the next tool that I'm going to introduce, which is it's called the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, I'll show it to you in a moment, basically takes this to the next level. It takes the concept of the 3Ds as well as some other forms of anti-Semitism, some more classical forms of anti-Semitism, and it puts them into a comprehensive definition, which can be adopted by different, I'll show it to you, by different governments, school boards, student unions, clubs, private companies, and it's kind of a very official, comprehensive definition. This is actually the official definition of anti-Semitism in Canada, as well as in Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia. I don't think Alberta, so you can work on that. Once we go through it, we'll see how why it's so beneficial for provinces and governments and student unions and school boards to adopt this definition. But just to give you a little bit of background, it was created by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is an alliance of over 30 different representatives from over 30 different countries around the world, who basically came together to come up with this definition because, as we saw earlier, the dictionary definitions of anti-Semitism, again, are so vague that they're very hard to actually use practically when it comes to educating about anti-Semitism or tracking anti-Semitism in any real way. And so what they did was they sought to create a definition, and it's a working definition, which means it can be updated as needed, that is comprehensive, that really covers all the bases of what anti-Semitism can look like today, in order so that it would be easier to track and educate about. So it's not even though countries have adopted it and it's the legal definition, it's not a law. So it doesn't, it doesn't make anything illegal or talk about consequences or anything like that. It's simply to be used as a guide so that when an incident occurs, we know how to judge clearly whether it is or is not anti-Semitic. And so the definition, does anyone want to volunteer to just read this little paragraph here with the definition? So I'll answer that in a minute. But just to kind of, point out, so this is the definition, and it's not so much more specific than the dictionary definitions. It goes into a little more detail with the second sentence. But what we're going to see in a moment is that what IHRA then does is it brings 11 different examples of what anti-Semitism looks like today in the 21st century. And with those examples, we have a very comprehensive understanding of what anti-Semitism might look like, and it's much easier for us to identify it when it occurs. To answer your question, why can it be directed towards non-Jewish individuals? So I actually remember reading a headline or maybe an article, I forget who it was about, but there was an actor who portrayed a Jewish person in a movie. It might have been like a biographical movie about a famous Jewish person. I don't remember who. And this actor started getting anti-Semitic hate mail, even though they weren't Jewish, because they were portraying a Jewish person. They started getting all of this hate. So I think the reason that it includes the possibility that it might be directed towards non-Jewish individuals or their properties is because sometimes if someone's thought to be Jewish or mistaken to be Jewish, and they are the victims of something that would be anti-Semitic if the person were Jewish, then it's still considered an anti-Semitic incident, even if the person perpetrating it was wrong and just got the wrong address or got the wrong information about who was Jewish or not. So it still only counts as anti-Semitism when it comes from a hatred of Jews. It just sometimes might be directed at people who aren't actually Jewish themselves. It could be even directed at someone who's maybe considered to be too friendly with the Jewish people or too supportive of Jewish people. So it's still very much focused on Jews. It just does allow for the possibility that sometimes someone non-Jewish might actually become the victim of anti-Semitism because of some association with Jewish people. Does that make sense? Okay, great question. There's an important point that comes right after this main part of the definition. And by the way, you can Google IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and this will come up. The next part of the definition states that manifestations of anti-Semitism could include the targeting of the state of Israel, conceived as a Jewish collectivity. So what that means is that today we have Israel, we have this Jewish state. And Israel pretty much is the most publicly Jewish thing that there is in the world today. Like individual Jewish people aren't so big or so public, but Israel is on a map. Israel is, at the United Nations. Israel is a very strong and powerful country. And so what this is saying is that Israel can actually be the target, even though it's not a person. It can be the target of anti-Semitism because it represents the Jewish people. It represents Judaism out there in the world. Then it goes on to say, however, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. So what this is saying is that there's a fine line, because Israel could be the victim of anti-Semitism, and we'll see what that might look like. But at the same time, we have to be mindful that if some sort of criticism of Israel is similar to what would be said about another country in the world, then it's not anti-Semitic, it's just criticism of Israel. So now we'll go through the examples and hopefully get a better picture of why IHRA is so helpful. So one of the examples that IHRA gives is calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or extremist view of religion. I think that one's quite obvious. Some of them are quite obvious, and some of them we'll discuss a little bit more. But obviously calling for or justifying the killing or harming of Jews is anti-Semitic. Making demonizing, dehumanizing, stereotypical allegations about Jews or the power of Jews as a collective. So that is definitely anti-Semitic. Accusing Jews as being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, or even things done by non-Jews. That is anti-Semitic, as well as holding Jews responsible for actions of the state of Israel. And this is something we see a lot when Israel does something that people are unhappy with. We might see some sort of anti-Semitic graffiti spray painted on a shul, a synagogue here in Canada, even though that's an example of holding us responsible as Canadian Jews, responsible for the acts of the Israeli government, the state of Israel. And this one I think is interesting because it's something that is so clearly unacceptable when it comes to other groups of people, right? Again, to go back to the COVID example, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we saw an increase in hate crimes targeted towards Asians in North America and I believe Europe as well. And basically they were being blamed for bringing this virus to the West. And while the people perpetrating these crimes obviously thought that was legitimate, there was an outcry from the rest of the world saying this is unacceptable. You can't hold people responsible for actions of the Chinese, government. That's not fair. That's not right. That's racist. And we can't do that. That's unacceptable. And yet when it comes to the Jewish people, we don't see that same outcry or that same kind of response from the broader society saying this is unacceptable, this is not fair, this is not right. So I think that's interesting and something to be aware of. Drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. So this would be an example of demonization of Israel, to go back to Natan Sharansky's 3Ds. Accusing the Jewish people of inventing the Holocaust or denying the Holocaust, that's definitely anti-Semitic. Accusing Jewish, this one's interesting, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. So sometimes people will say to me, well, wait, I am more loyal to Israel than I am to, Canada or wherever. And the first thing that I would say is that's okay, that's totally fine. But maybe don't, go around telling your non-Jewish friends that. It might not go over so well. But really the point here is this is not anti-Semitic because it's not true. So if someone says, oh, we can't trust you, you're not a good citizen of Canada because you're more loyal to Israel than you are to Canada, or we don't want you to serve on our student government because you're Jewish and you're only going to care about the other Jewish students in Israel than you will about our school, what's best for our school. And that sometimes does happen. The reason that's anti-Semitic is not because it's not true. Again, it may or may not be true for each individual person, and that's fine. The reason it's anti-Semitic is because this is an accusation that's pretty much only leveled at Jews. Generally speaking, today, we view it as a very positive thing for people from minority groups to seek out positions of leadership and to have their voices heard and to have representation on things like student government. And yet they're not accused of being more loyal to their own minority group than they are to the broader community. It's only when it's a Jewish person that we have this accusation. So again, we're kind of going back to that double standard. And that's why this is anti-Semitic, because it's not something that other people are accused of in the way that Jews are. And the last few examples, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. So this one is basically anti-Zionism, saying we don't have the right to a Jewish state. We don't have the right to live independently in Israel. Applying double standards by requiring a behavior not expected of any other democratic nation. So again, this is directly from Natan Sharansky's 3D test, saying that If Israel is held to a higher standard of behavior than any other democracy would be held, that's anti-Semitic, that's not fair. And finally, using symbols and images associated with classical anti-Semitism to characterize Israel or Israelis. So all of those things we spoke about towards the beginning, Jews being obsessed with money or being depicted as kind of animals, Jews trying to control the world, any of those things being applied to Israel is also anti-Semitic. So as you can see with the IHRA examples, it gives us a much clearer picture of what anti-Semitism typically looks like today. And if your local government, student council, school board adopts IHRA, it then makes it much easier for us to track and respond to anti-Semitism, because when we only have kind of the dictionary definitions of anti-Semitism, we get into a lot of situations where there's sort of a he said, she said, right? The Jewish community might come out and say, oh, this is anti-Semitic. And the person perpetrating it says, no, it's not. I'm not anti-Semitic. And there's not really anywhere to go from there. And that we see a lot, especially with different school boards saying like, well, there's not really anything we can do about this until they've adopted the IHRA definition, and then they have a clear-cut sort of place to turn when they're not sure if something should be categorized as anti-Semitic or not. Any questions about the IHRA definition or the 3D test before we move on? Okay. So then the question becomes, if all of these things are unacceptable, if all of these things that we just went through are anti-Semitic, is it possible to criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic? And if so, how can we do that? So does anyone want to unmute and share any thoughts about this? What might be things that we could say or that people could say that would not be considered anti-Semitic, even though they're criticizing Israel? Any like guidelines around that you think would be acceptable? So as long as you're only criticizing the actions of the government, but not blaming the whole Jewish people, you're saying that would be acceptable? Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. Anyone else have anything to add? Okay. So here are some guidelines in terms of what is considered to be legitimate criticism of Israel. And I think you really got it. Oh, did someone else want to add something? Okay. So disagreeing with Israel's policies, so saying, I don't agree with this law or with this way that Israel handles this situation, I don't think it's right. Not a problem. Just like we can disagree with Canada's policies, with America's policies, with any other government's policies, it's not a problem. It's not anti-Semitic to have things that we are critical of or disagree with. Same thing with the actions of Israel's leadership. So saying, I don't think that, you know, the Israeli prime minister did the right thing in this situation, or I don't like this statement that they made. That's not a problem. And holding Israel responsible for its mistakes. So if you think that Israel did something that wasn't right and that they should make it right in some way, that is an example of that's an example of something that's legitimate, that's not anti-Semitic. The key really is that all of these things have to be done within the framework of Israel's right to exist. So to say, I don't like Israel's policy on X, that's fine. That's not anti-Semitic. That's legitimate criticism. The problem is when it crosses the line into, therefore, Israel should be wiped off the map. Therefore, Israel doesn't have the right to exist because of X policy. And that's really something we don't see when it comes to other countries. There are many countries out there that people are highly critical of right now. You know, people have a lot of problems with the Russian government, for example, and their actions right now. Same thing with the Chinese government, with many different governments around the world, Iran. And yet we never really see the criticism go to the point where we say, so let's just get rid of the country. Let's just hand it over to someone else and start from scratch. We see people saying we want a change in policy or a change in leadership, or we want them to be held accountable. And again, those are all legitimate criticisms that can be made of Israel as well. When it crosses the line and someone says, therefore, let's wipe Israel off the map, therefore Israel's an illegitimate country, that's when we start to really think, okay, maybe this is actually crossing the line into anti-Semitism. And a good kind of one-liner test is, could this statement be made about any other country or group without being considered racist? And if the answer is yes, then it's probably legitimate criticism of Israel. And if the answer is no, then we might actually be dealing with anti-Semitism. So then the question becomes, what do we do about it? When we find something that we think crosses the line, that is anti-Semitic, what do we do? And there are a few different things that you can do, both in terms of you yourself, what you can do if you encounter it, as well as getting help from external sources. One is that you can always reach out to us. Our organization has a lot of resources, educational resources, legal tools. We have a legal task force of pro bono lawyers that help us out with situations. So you can definitely always reach out to us, and we'll put our contact information on the last slide. If you are dealing with a situation that you think is anti-Semitic and you're not sure how to proceed. I believe, Jen, that the local federation also wants to know about these incidents and to be informed, and they also have resources that they can assist you as well. So definitely reaching out to them, letting them know.
That's true, for sure. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning.
Sometimes there might be other relevant people to notify. So if something happens in school, letting your teacher know, or letting the administration know. If there are other organizations that are relevant, if you're on campus, there might be, a Hillel or something like that. So it depends a little bit where you are, but definitely, letting people know what's going on, especially Jewish community organizations that are really there to help you. If it happens on social media, so you see something on TikTok or on Instagram or Twitter, you should always be reporting it. All of these platforms have guidelines and have protocol for when hate is spread on their platform. They're not always, unfortunately, the best at acting on it or acting on it quickly, but it should always be reported and reported to the platform so that they can remove it and potentially block people's accounts if necessary, or take the next steps, whatever their policies are. If something that happens is criminal in nature, then getting the police involved is also important, but only if it's actually criminal in nature. Otherwise, there's not really anything that they can do. And in terms of you yourself, what can you do on your own? So one option is always responding. If you feel comfortable and you feel safe and someone has said something that you think is anti-Semitic, trying to explain to them and have a conversation explaining why you're uncomfortable with whatever it was that they said or did is always an option. Again, if you feel comfortable and safe doing so. If it comes from a teacher specifically, you can try speaking to them about it if you feel comfortable. If they're not responsive or you're nervous to engage them directly, you can speak to someone higher up in the school, so a principal or someone else in the school administration. Generally speaking, it's good to have some sort of request or call to action. So if you're going to say to someone that something they did or said was anti-Semitic, it's good to kind of not only point out the problem, but also have some sort of solution. So I would appreciate if you would, explain to the class why this information was wrong that you shared yesterday. Or I would appreciate if you would post an apology on social media, or could you delete the post that you shared, which was anti-Semitic? Whatever, depends on the situation, what you're asking for, but it's good to have some suggestion of how they can make it right and how they can fix it. It's important to keep a record as well. So especially if something's happening more than once, but even if it's just one time, if you can keep some sort of record, that's really important in terms of next steps. So if you can take a photo or a video or an audio recording, or even just keep a written log of what's going on, that can be really helpful down the line. And finally, this is something that it's not always the best approach, and I would definitely consult with us, consult with Federation or whoever else you're involved with before doing this, but sometimes exposing the matter is helpful. So writing some sort of article for your school newspaper, posting a video online, getting some sort of media coverage. Again, it's not always helpful. Sometimes it can make things worse. So it's important to consult with organizations and people who deal with these kinds of things regularly and can sort of help strategize when this will help and when it might actually make things worse. It definitely shouldn't be the first resort. But that is definitely something that will sometimes be recommended. And someone said in the chat, mentioning it to your parents. Yes, definitely. That would probably fall under other relevant people would definitely be your parents. Thank you. If something's happening